Okay, so welcome. This is our very first class of this series on the 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas. So I'll go ahead and lead the prayers tonight, unless Stella's going to.
I can't hear you if you don't have your...
Oh, sorry. Forgot my little thing. I just start talking. In Santa Fe, we have the microphone there in front of me, so I don't have to do that. But okay. Stella, were you going to lead the prayers, or do you?
Oh.
If I put them on the screen, can you see them on the screen?
No, but I can use the book here.
Okay. I can lead them too if you want. It's really up to you.
I can't even see that far. I'm losing everything.
Yeah. Do you want me to lead them though, or?
And I'm fine reading it, but if you want to do it, it's fine too. Okay. Opening prayers. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times.
The founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the
short mandala, once in English.
This ground,
anointed with perfumes, strewn with flowers, adorned with found berries, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as good of you, Lord Almighty. May all living beings enjoy this spiritual land.
Refuge, in general, we can go to Chico. Once in English and twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I align to the Buddha of the knowledge experience daily. But others I create through listening to the Dharma. Now I become a Buddha in order to benefit all entities. Sangye Chodam Soge Chodam La Jam Chubar Dharmi Kyam Suchi Dati Chanyen Te Pesonanki Drola Pencha Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodam Soge Chodam La Jam Chubar Dharmi Kyam Suchi Dati Chanyen Te Pesonanki Drola Pencha Sangye Druparsho.
And thank you, Stella, for leading the prayers. Thank you all. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin today's class. So we're going to just spend a few minutes as usual focusing the mind. You can use whatever technique you prefer to use with the breath to do that. Try to keep your awareness with the breath when it wanders and gently guide the mind back to the breath. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight's class.
Mm. 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 Mm.
Now let's take a moment to set our motivation for tonight, but also for this entire course, this teaching, this text that we're going to be looking at. It's all around the practices of bodhisattvas. It includes, of course, not just those who are bodhisattvas, but those like ourselves who are aspiring to follow that path, to become a bodhisattva, to dedicate ourselves to becoming a Buddha for the benefit of all beings. So let's reflect briefly on this mind of compassion that is so central to the Mahayana teachings, the Bodhisattva practices. Last week we did a practice of the Buddha of compassion. And we looked at the various aspects of compassion that we need to hold some awareness of. But it is important that we take in and have a good understanding of the suffering that beings are going through. And certainly see the grosser forms of suffering that are happening in our world all around us, even happening to some of us. Things that are going on in our lives that are quite obviously suffering, quite obviously unsatisfactory. We also have the fact that everything that we experience that brings some level of pleasure or happiness also has that taint of unsatisfactoriness. Doesn't really do the trick. We aren't able to really solve our problem by engaging in these transitory pleasures. And again, that's because every one of us is involved in a process. We're under the control of our own deluded minds, the karma that we create on the basis of that, and just continuing to be in this unenlightened existence from lifetime to lifetime. So with an awareness of that, the extent to which there is this unsatisfactoriness, suffering in the world, The Bodhisattva's response is to want to alleviate it, to want to do something to address it. And it's driven by a genuine concern for beings, a feeling of affection towards them. Because when we understand that beings are under the control of these factors and continuing to suffer because of them, our heart should naturally open to their situation. And we also recognize these beings have been incredibly kind to us and benefited us lifetime after lifetime. We can open our hearts even further. So the response to the suffering of the world is to want to alleviate that suffering that exists and to even be the agent of doing that. This is the Bodhisattva's mind, the mentality, to want to address the suffering in the world, to not just sit back and feel bad about it or wish that it was not there, but to actually do whatever we can to help beings to be free from their suffering. So before we begin our study of this text that goes into these various practices, generate the mind of bodhicitta, the mind that aspires to help sentient beings to that degree, alleviating them from their suffering, protecting them from all fear, everything that is unsatisfactory, and helping them to achieve their greatest potential, the potential to be this blissful, completely awakened being, a Buddha. And then recognizing that to do that for others, we have to achieve that result ourselves first. Once we become a Buddha, we can then help others very skillfully, spontaneously, effortlessly to achieve their own potential as well. And all these practices we're going to look at are embedded in that mind, that wish that each of us is generating now to become a Buddha so we can benefit all sentient beings. So hold that very deeply in your heart tonight, but as well as throughout this course as we embark upon the study of this wonderful text by Togme Sangpo. And you can open your eyes fully and come back into the space together. Okay, so I want to just do a little mini background. Actually, when I taught this, I taught the first session, as many of you know, I'm teaching the same thing in Santa Fe and Taos this summer because I'm on jury duty and I had no idea how much time I was going to need for that, plus the other things that I do. It's turning out there's not much jury duty, but nonetheless, I'm appreciating having a little bit easier schedule in terms of teaching the same thing in both locations. But on Sunday, one of the questions we got from someone who was there was, why are you teaching this text right now? I'm just curious. They're just wanting to know. And I mean, I think it's a perfectly fine place to start. I have to admit that I was really taken by this text when I first saw. This is the early version of this book. It's been republished with a different cover. Stella has the one that's the republished edition of it. The 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas. It's a commentary by Geshe Sonam Rinchen, and it's very thin. You know, this appeared on a bookshelf at Secheng, where I had just started studying the year before. It was 1997 when this was released, and it was there on the shelves. And I said, that looks great. I need to read this. And then it just so happened that summer of 97, there was a course at Secheng in San Francisco that was led by John Landau, who has taught here before. He did teach in City Garba quite a few years ago. Unfortunately, he's had to retire from teaching. He's more or less living outside of where he was before. He's living in Watsonville, California. But he's an amazing teacher, and he really invited us all into this text and kind of helped us to kind of see the value of it. Just so happened that I also had teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2002 at the Palachakra in Graz, Austria, while I was studying over in Italy. His Holiness taught that as part of the preliminary teachings before their Palachakra. He always does that, like 2 or 3 days of teachings before an initiation like that. And then even my teacher in Italy, Geshe Gyaltso, taught this. And I looked at the date on the materials, the version of the text that we're going to be working with, and it said 2003. So I'm assuming that's around when he taught that. Our coordinator for the master's program, Venerable Joan Nysel, she's a Canadian nun. She translated the text as well as the commentary. And so I do want to share that when my teacher in Italy, Geshe Gyatso, taught the master's program, he always taught it in Tibetan because, it's a philosophical text and what have you. It's really much easier to work with the Tibetan for somebody who doesn't have English as their first language. And yet on the weekends, when he would do these teachings like the 37 Practices and other long-run texts, he would teach in English. And it was always so precious to hear him teach in English. He always called it his broken English, but essentially it was very endearing the way that he would convey these teachings. So he actually wrote the commentary that we're going to be working with. It's a very brief commentary on these verses, and I'll be expanding on that. But I've always wanted to teach this text, and it just seems like there's never been a block of time that I've been allotted recently where I go, oh, let me do this. Because Geshe Cherub has also taught it. I didn't attend all of his teachings. I think the first time he did this when he was on tour in 2010, I believe it was, he taught at Santa Fe 2 weekends where he went through the entire text. So I think I did go to those. But then he taught it again in 2019, just before the pandemic. And so anyway, I'm happy to finally have some space in the calendar here in Taos, as well as down in Santa Fe, to be here and to be able to teach this text really for the first time. Occasionally talk about certain verses in it, but it really is quite an amazing text. We'll go into the text in a moment and kind of talk about it a bit. But essentially, that's why I'm teaching it. And I'm very happy that all of you are okay with me, doing this as part of, my summer program. So let's go ahead and go. We're going to start with some slides and go through a number of topics. Tonight is mainly an introduction, but we will get into some of the texts and even the first verse of 37 Practices. But mainly, I want to introduce you to the author and the text. The author, sometimes Gyaltse is spelled slightly different, but this is roughly how it's pronounced from the Tibetan. Gyaltse Togme Sangpo. By the word Gyaltse, we'll see, means Bodhisattva. So he's being called a Bodhisattva. It's a kind of an honorific title to give to him. His name, Togme Sangpo, essentially means unhindered goodness or excellence. He had this kind of just like way of being. He was the sort of the Bodhisattva personified and was really quite an amazing practitioner. He lived from 1295 to 1369. You'll sometimes see slightly different dates. Everything is in the lunar calendar, so you have to often translate it into Western calendar, but essentially this is around the time he lived. Those of you who are familiar with our tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, you'll know that Lama Tsongkhapa was like 12 years old when Togme Sangpo passed away. So essentially this is predating Lama Tsongkhapa, who is the founder of this last of the 4 branches of Tibetan Buddhism, the Gelug tradition. The one just previous to that was the Sakya. He was a great Sakya scholar. And of course, Lama Tsongkhapa started as a Sakya scholar. His teacher, Rendawa, was an amazing Sakya master. The Sakyas are essentially in the third of these 4 traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. The 4 traditions, just to make sure everyone knows, they started with the Nyingma, which is usually translated as the ancient school. That was the initial sort of influx, migration of teachings from India into Tibet. That happened in the 700s, 8th century, right in there, 7th, 8th century. The key figures there were Shantarakshita, who really set up the monastic tradition there, and Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, who was this amazing master who came in and kind of helped to tame some of the forces in Tibet that were not so conducive to the Dharma. And one of them, of course, was the Bon tradition. That was the more spiritual animistic tradition that was there prior to Buddhism. And now it's still there, but it's become like a 5th branch of Buddhism. And there's really not much difference now between the Bon tradition and the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. But they're not all that far apart, even though we have the Nyingmas we started with, again, around that time. Around the turn of the century, about 1,000 years ago, is when the Kagyu tradition started. And that was all these great masters like Gompopa and Milarepa and so on, Tilopa. And then you had about 100 years later, the Sakyas forming. And Sakya Pandita, I think, was the main one who initiated that whole branch of Tibetan Buddhism. And none of them were seen as like extreme changes in what happened, just a new lineage, kind of a tree that all has the same roots and trunk, but just a new branch kind of coming off. And then the last one, of course, was Lama Tsongkhapa, who again lived 1357 to 1419. So essentially, he was the last sort of main branch of Tibetan Buddhism to form in Tibet. So anyway, going back to Togme Sangpo was really, again, quite an amazing practitioner. I want to talk a little bit about his life. If you do have any curiosity about his life beyond that, apparently there is an entire biography in Tibetan. Of course, you don't know Tibetan, you have to rely upon some of these introductions to the commentaries on this text, such as this one from Digo Khyentse Rinpoche. It's called The Heart of Compassion. It has probably the longest biography in the introduction, and it's not horribly long. It's from pages, let me see if I can find, looks like around 20 something, 26. It's like more or less from 9 to 26. So it's not really tons of pages, but it does talk in there a bit about his life. He was raised mainly by his uncle. His parents passed away when he was quite young, but then he went off and was ordained at the young age of 14. And he entered into the monastery, became known as an amazing scholar, was studying the texts extensively. His main practices focused on the Mahayana, and one of his most revered texts was Shantideva's texts engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds, which most of you know, you've studied it here or there, or at least read some of it. It really is kind of like the long version of the 37 practices. The 37 practices is a condensation of the main practices that are highlighted in there. But that text is frequently studied in our tradition and in many Buddhist traditions because it's really quite rich in terms of the detail he goes into there. But nonetheless, this was, he became known, again, kind of embodying this selfless way of going about living his life as a bodhisattva. There's a wonderful story that I want to share from the introduction in that book that, again, I had initially seen back in 1997 when it was published, that really shows the extent to which he was this bodhisattva practitioner. It says when he was about 30, he was staying in a monastery near Sakya, studying Mahayana texts on training the mind. By the road behind the monastery lived a destitute man completely covered with lice. So again, we have people in our culture now who are unhoused on the streets, men and women who are very similar to that, living in, pretty destitute conditions, right? So anyway, this man was covered with lice. Togme Sangpo used to look after him and bring him food at night. One night, the man wasn't in his usual place, and though Togme Sangpo waited, the man didn't return. Next morning, Togme searched high and low and eventually found the man huddled in a hollow. And he asked him why he had gone there. And the man replied that people were so sickened by his disgusting state, they'd driven him away. So, again, can identify this with this in our culture now, right? That there are many people in our own country, on the streets of our cities and so on, who are often driven away because people don't like their looks, their smell, whatever the case might be. And it says here then, Togme Sangpo was moved to tears, and that is actually one other thing that's said about him. He cried a lot. He even cried during his teachings extensively. He had another teacher, Bhutan Rinpoche, who they said when you go to Bhutan Rinpoche's teachings, you would laugh. When you go to Togme Sangpo's, you would cry because of the teachings that he gave and the way that he gave them. But anyway, he was crying, was moved to tears when he saw this. So that night, he took the man back to his room. He fed him till he was satisfied. He then told him to take off his clothes. Togme Sangpo gave him a clean sheepskin coat along with a few other necessities and sent him on his way. And the story doesn't stop there because now he's got this sheepskin coat that's got lice in it, right? Now he had the problem of what to do with the old coat full of lice, for if he just threw it away, all the lice would die, right? Determined to nourish them with his own blood, he put on the coat. Soon he began to look and feel awful and could no longer attend classes. After some days, a classmate came to see what had happened and discovered that Togme was quite ill and depleted. When he reported what he had found to the others, opinions were divided. Some said, oh, well, Togme is an admirable practitioner. And others felt it was wrong for a beginner like this to sacrifice his body in that way. Finally, one of them begged him to get rid of the lice for their sake. But he answered that he had lost body after body meaninglessly in past lives, and that this time he meant to make a gift of his body in this way. After 17 days, the lice began to die naturally, and no new ones were born. He picked out all the dead lice, said mantras over them, then he ground them up, mixed the powder with clay, and made these votive tablets, the sattsas, essentially, out of them, these small statues. Normally, the bones of those we revere and whose kindness we cherish, such as our teachers or parents, are treated in this way. But, this is what Togme Sangpo did for these lice. It's, again, a wonderful example about how he did not want even these little creatures who most of us would be so happy to get rid of and probably even maybe not take delight in killing, but we would certainly not want to live even 17 days with those things infesting our body, right? When you hear about like hotels with bed bugs, things like this, it's bad enough, right? And most of us are not there. It is said, certainly, that, the bodhisattva eventually should get to a place in their generosity where they'd happily give their body to other beings. Togme Sangpo was there. He was actually able to do that. So he was this amazing example of somebody who could really use his life meaningfully. It's said that even he had, and there's two different stories. One is it's a cat that he has. Another one is it was a fox who he tamed and became like his companion. But regardless, these animals that hung out with Togme Sangpo, they apparently became vegetarian in his presence. He was so calm in his way of kind of living his life of non-harming, not harming any other beings, that these animals around him even became like them. Kind of reminded me when I first read these stories of St. Francis of Assisi, right? This amazing example of a being who could tame wolves and do all these kind of things, was just like this being who had this natural presence to him that allowed others to calm their minds, to be, having a different way of living. So again, you can read more on that. Yeah, John.
Was he also called the Bodhisattva always crying?
No, that's a different being. It could be a moniker we could give to him as well, right? Because of all this tears that he shed and everything. But there is this other Bodhisattva always crying. And I think they use him as an example of guru devotion, because he would always frequently cry thinking about the kindness of his guru and things like that. Togme Sangpo, I'm sure he had other thoughts as well, but Togme Sangpo was definitely somebody who was motivated by compassion for beings and doing everything that he could. So essentially, that's enough maybe about Togme Sangpo. Let's go back to the slides. I want to talk a little bit about the title of the text and maybe, explore this idea of 37 as well as what do we mean by this? The title in Tibetan, kind of abbreviated, is Gyalse Laklan So Dunman. 37 is in there. There are 37 main verses. However, you'll note when we get into the actual text that it starts with, of course, one line homage and then has two verses that are preliminary. And then at the end, it has four more verses that are a conclusion. So technically it has 43 verses, but nonetheless, the 37 that are enumerated are the main verses. So why 37? Well, some of you may have heard in some of your reading and studying, there is this thing called the 37 Harmonies with Enlightenment, which constitute a main part of Buddhist practice for both those on the individual vehicle path, what we often call in Sanskrit the Hinayana, which are those beings who are trying to attain their own liberation, which is a very noble goal and the ultimate results of achieving their own nirvana. But then there's the Mahayana, which again is what we're mainly studying here, which are the beings who are devoted to achieving Buddhahood, going beyond their own liberation, to become a Buddha to benefit other beings. So essentially, whether you're practicing either of those paths, you need to engage in these 37 harmonies with enlightenment. They are not identical to the 37 practices in any way, but 37 is a number. I know, John, you're always encouraging me to do my Buddhism by the Numbers book. That's one of the numbers, 37. We have 37 there. I don't know if we have 37 in that many other places, but those of you who've ever done the mandala offerings, where you use the mandala offering kit with the base and then the rings, and you put all the stuff in there and you visualize. If you do the full mandala offering, which is an amazing, beautiful offering to the Buddhas, to our gurus, and so on, there are 37 heaps in that full offering. 37 things that you're visualizing as you're doing that. And so in my thinking about it, and this isn't from any of my teachers, but maybe this is what this is supposed to be. It's kind of like 37 heaps of practice, 37 things that in Togme Sangpo's estimation, we're kind of making this perfect offering. Because again, recall, one of the things we're going to look at tonight when we get to the beginning of this text, that the guru is really the heart of so much of our practice. And how do we pay back the kindness of our gurus to the greatest degree? By practicing what they teach. So if we have these amazing Mahayana gurus, beings who are telling us, you should do this and you should do that, these are all the things you need to do to get enlightened, and Togme Sangpo has delineated them in these 37 practices, well, then that's the best offering we can make, is to actually engage in all of this. So I like that kind of analogy of these 37 practices being like a huge, beautiful mandala, these jeweled practices that we are offering. In the commentary from Geshe Gyaltsen, Geshe Tsultrim Gyaltsen, who was actually the Geshe in Long Beach, at the center there, Thupten Dargilin. You're going to see a reference to that area in a moment when we get to the commentary that you do have out there that you can use. He said that literally the words that are there, it's in the Tibetan up there, lak len. Lak means hand, and len means a handle. So the idea is you have kind of in your hand something you are handling, like a handle that you're just holding and engaging in something, which is kind of a strange derivation of the word practice, but it does make some sense, right? These are the things that are in the hand of the bodhisattvas. They are what they handle, what they actually take care of, what they tend to. So that's kind of the connotation of that. When we say practices, of course, we're meaning the variety of activities that bodhisattvas engage in. Many of them meditations, but many of them also acts of generosity, for example, other acts of kindness and so on, that are inspired by their bodhicitta motivation. The last term that's translated in the title of this course as bodhisattvas, that's the more common way it's translated, literally means children of the conquerors, gyalse. Gyalse is got a slightly different kind. Usually when we talk about bodhisattvas, we call them, what is it? Sem, something sem. Why am I not thinking of this? Jongsam. Anyway, the idea is that there are different terms for bodhisattvas. This one is talking about the fact that they are sort of the offspring in a sense, but not completely in a literal way, of the Buddhas, the conquerors. The Buddhas are, of course, the beings who have achieved that state of complete Buddhahood. They tend to the bodhisattvas as if they're their children, essentially, because they're going to become future Buddhas. Bodhisattvas are in line to, follow in their footsteps and to become enlightened beings themselves. So there is this kind of connotation of them, bodhisattvas, being the children of the conquerors. Now, I know in some of the more earlier translations, they use the sons of the conquerors. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche would always kind of give some credence to that by saying in traditional India, it is the sons, the princes, who take over when the kings are gone, right? So you have that progression, but it's all a patriarchal thing, right? So anyway, I like that in our translation, we've translated as children of the conquerors. So there's no gender bias and there is no gender bias in Mahayana Buddhism. You might see some things written. Sometimes it seems like it's more favorable to be reborn a male, but that's simply because the culture at the time, and even in our culture today, there are many more benefits for people who are born male often than people who are born female. And unfortunately, we're living in the wake of continual patriarchal systems that have really, there's even a resurgence of that in the United States right now, of trying to say women shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that, and they shouldn't vote, and kind of crazy stuff when you look at how far we've come. But nonetheless, and know that, again, in the Mahayana is equal opportunity. Everyone can engage in the teachings and achieve the result. So we are translating it generally as bodhisattvas, but as I said, you'll see in our text Venerable Joan used the more literal translation of Children of the Conquerors. So this is the title of our text. We're done with these 37 practices, these amazing jewels, these things that bodhisattvas handle, because they are in the natural progression to become Buddhas. They are, again, those who are aspiring to achieve that goal. Yes, Andrea.
I have a silly question.
Sure, no problem.
Do the numbers like 37, does that have any, and when we do our mantras, that's 109, do those have any, numbers have any significance to the Buddhists?
They do have some significance in terms of things that they might represent or allude to. Even like the 108, I think it usually is in a mala. Sometimes they're different numbers, but I've heard that there's a reference to that in terms of when the Buddha set out all the phenomena. I mean, not down to the individual things, because obviously there are many, many things, but when he did a classification of phenomena, he did the thoroughly afflicted class, and then he did the completely purified class. And those combined are 108. And so I've heard that that's a reference for why you have 108 beads on the mala, but there are all these numbers that have become very auspicious and very powerful within Buddhist practice simply because of tradition and those things referring to something else. But, there's not anything beyond that. The numbers don't have any particular kind of power to them per se, other than the familiarization we have with them and using them again and again to allude to things. But as I said, the only two things I could find besides this text, the 37 practices, where you have that number 37, are the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, which is actually a pretty important topic. But yeah, I'm not going to go into that as part of it because it's really not what this text is about per se. And then this 37 heaps of this mandala offering. So sometimes numbers have more significance than that, but the number 3 crops up a lot. But, again, that's why John wants me to write this book of the
Prevent you doing your homework.
Yeah, I haven't exhausted 37. There might be other references to 37 out there that I've missed, but okay, let me see. Is there anything else that we can say certainly, as Geshe Gyaltsen says, these are 37 essential job descriptions of a bodhisattva. Now, as I said in the meditation tonight, it's of a bodhisattva or of someone who's aspiring to be a bodhisattva. As we'll see, we're going to get into bodhicitta being one of these practices and cultivating that mind. Until you cultivate that mind in a very deep way to where you have it spontaneously arising, it's what we call uncontrived bodhicitta. Until you reach that moment, you don't really have the title of bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is a title reserved for those who have cultivated that mind to that degree. So when it says 37 practices of bodhisattvas, don't think, well, I'm not a bodhisattva, so what are these about? Well, they're about what somebody does when they are a bodhisattva, but they're also about what we do as we're preparing to be a bodhisattva. So this is completely, within the realm of what we are all trying to practice in our tradition, in the FPMT and what have you. It is also worth noting that as we approach this text and the various pieces of advice in it, I want to share a little bit from some other teachers, and I'll talk about these teachers and the books that they published on this text. Venerable Thupten Chodron, I think, is the main one here. I might have another quote that I share later, but I think this is mainly from her. She wrote a book called Don't Believe Everything You Think, and this is a commentary she did on the 37 practices. But she says there are 2 ways to teach these practices. That's kind of advice for me in a sense, but it's also, you as listening to my teachings, 2 ways for you to practice what I'm teaching, right? The first way helps us to solve our current problems and have more happiness in this life. Now, generally, we say the Dharma, that isn't the main purpose of the Dharma. In fact, the Dharma is meant to address things beyond this life. But you can still see some sort of unraveling and working with things in your life by virtue of following the advice that's in these verses. Because that is part of the wonder of the Buddhist teaching. Even if we look at, again, I'm going to touch on some of the main teachings that are involved in this. We essentially have 2 main bodies of teachings that most of you are familiar with, not all of you. One is the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, which is something we teach all the time in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, especially in this Gelugpa tradition. It's a sequential way of going through the Buddhist teachings to achieve enlightenment, the stages of the path to enlightenment. So essentially, what we are dealing with in a good part of this text is long-run teaching. So it's nothing that's that foreign to you. It's just a different way of presenting those teachings. But the other one is lojong, or mind training teachings. And I've taught some of that up here. Geshe Sherab has taught some of that up here. Lojong is a branch of Tibetan Buddhist teachings that are rooted in what the Buddha taught, with a particular emphasis on making everything extremely practical in our daily lives. So particularly, long-run teachings can have a big effect on our daily life. But the lojong teachings are about how do we work with everything that's coming up for us in any day, at any moment of that day. How do we actually transform it and use it? And in that way, you will have greater peace and happiness in this life. Because what would normally trouble you and cause you to have problems will actually be a source of great spiritual advancement and spiritual development. There's going to be a whole set of verses in this text that deal with transforming these various adverse conditions into the path. Yes.
Don, are the Bodhisattvas experiencing samsara the way we are?
So the question from Stella is, are the Bodhisattvas experiencing samsara the way we are? Well, it depends upon the level of Bodhisattva. If you talk about Bodhisattvas who have not yet realized emptiness, well, then their experiences are pretty close to what we have ourselves, right? Because they haven't generated that deeper wisdom that really does help transform one's experience of samsara in a very deep way, in terms of the wisdom that one has that can be applied in our daily life. But prior to that, they certainly are gaining some deeper appreciation for the wisdom teachings and so on. So their experience would be slightly different, but nonetheless very similar to ours. As they go through the Bodhisattva path and they remove more and more obstructions in their mind, they become less and less embedded in samsara. Eventually they get to a point where they're no longer experiencing the same things in samsara that we are, but they still are involved in the world, right? And then they keep developing their minds till they become a Buddha. When you become a Buddha, you are free of everything that we're currently dealing with in terms of our own obscurations that flavor our experience of samsara. But because of their compassion, they stay engaged in the world, right? Buddhas don't check out and go hang out with other Buddhas at the Buddha bar in Buddhaville. They are still active in the world. So they don't experience samsara in the way we do at all, but they continue to be an active force to help beings like ourselves to get to the other side, to get to the different experience that they have. So bodhisattvas are depends upon what level you're at, but you're moving out of the way that we experience samsara and having a deeper awareness that flavors all of that. But they're still active in the world, and they still are sentient beings until they become a Buddha. Okay, does that answer your question? Or do you have another question?
No, because I've always wondered about this, because I thought that one of the vows was that you take is, I won't become a Buddha until everybody else is out of samsara.
Yeah.
And so do they actually become Buddhas, or not really?
Well, they do. So Stella's point was, sometimes we hear this as like the bodhisattva ideal, that we make this vow that we will not become a Buddha until all beings are enlightened. It's impossible to do that, because the stronger your motivation to become a Buddha and even have that kind of selfless dedication to helping other beings, the quicker you actually become them. It's a paradox of the bodhisattva path. We often talk about, maybe I'll get into this in more detail later, 3 different levels of bodhicitta, depending upon the courageous power of one's mind. The most courageous, I'm just going to jump to that one. We'll talk about the other ones at another point. The most courageous is called the shepherd-like or shepherdess-like, where you are like a shepherd that is taking the sheep and making sure they're all safe and put to bed before you retire. That's that mind. It's like, I'm going to get everyone else to enlighten and take care of all of those beings, and then I'll become a Buddha. That's the most powerful mind you can generate, but it is the mind that will actually get you enlightened even more quickly. So those bodhisattvas, even with that most courageous level of bodhicitta, actually become Buddhas before the beings that they're leading to become Buddhists, I mean, generally, because you actually need to be enlightened in order to help others. If we aren't enlightened, how can we help others to that degree? You have to have the mind of a Buddha. The mind of a Buddha is an omniscient being that knows, like if a Buddha's observing me, which, Buddhas are observing all of us all the time. Don't think like it's a volitional thing, like, oh, I think I'll check out Eloise or I'll check out, Adrian or whatever. The Buddha's always knowing our minds and exactly responding, in accord with it and exactly, according to what we need. But essentially, if we don't have that ability to know what is the background of myself, my previous lives, everything that has happened, my predispositions, what's going on karmically for me, if they don't have all that knowledge, how can they help us perfectly? And a bodhisattva will not have all that knowledge until they become a Buddha. So you actually need the skills you will attain as a Buddha to benefit other beings. So again, this is part of the bodhisattva path, is you keep dedicating yourselves to the welfare of others so that when you achieve that state of this omniscient mind, you're just not hanging out in it. You are actually going to use that mind to then benefit all beings. You can benefit them to the greatest degree because you have that. So this is something that we're bringing up, Stella, is a bit of I don't want to say misnomer. We want to have that level of courage and conviction and say, I will make sure everyone else is in Buddhahood and then I'll become a Buddha. It's actually impossible to do that. You might wonder, well, then why do bodhisattvas make prayers for what's impossible? Well, because it's a very courageous mind to have. I mean, look at what happens even when we see people being very courageous on the battlefield. I mean, I hate to use that as an example, but there are people who sometimes are wounded themselves and they don't even think about it because they see others who are wounded to a greater degree and they are tending to them, giving them the medical treatment and care that they need. And then suddenly they look down after they've done all this and helped all these other people and go, oh my gosh, I'm bleeding. They don't even think of themselves, right? We admire that level of courage there of someone tending to others before they tend to themselves. It's admired in the world in general. For the bodhisattvas, it's an important part of really making sure that there's no real kind of selfish clinging, of like me needing my needs taken care of. But nonetheless, while we are on our training, do take care of yourself. Don't think that, because we're all moving in that direction, trying to become more and more courageous. Anyway, does that help give some context?
Yeah, I mean, I know you understand where I'm coming from with that, it's about making the vow and wondering.
But it's not really part of the vows that we make.
Yeah.
Literally. I mean, when you take the bodhisattva vow, you are not saying that you will get enlightened after everyone else. If you go back to the words of it, and you never make that statement, it is a part of enhancing your bodhicitta, making it more powerful to hold that view, but it's impossible to do. So I don't think the Buddha would ever give you a vow that's impossible to hold. So it is not really technically part of the bodhisattva vow.
But I mean, like I'm thinking in terms of the suffering. I mean, they can manifest suffering, but they probably aren't.
It depends upon their
is probably not experiencing pain the way we
Sure.
would experience it, right?
And it would depend upon the level of that bodhisattva as to what they're even experiencing. But yeah, even their relationship to pain or to problems or difficulties is going to change because of the mind and the practices they do. So yeah, it's all true. Yeah. So it's good, again, to adopt these states of mind, but once more recognize that, it's anyway, right? It's dependent upon our own situation, but we really do want to keep moving in that direction. But going back to what I was alluding to, this first way of working with the teachings does help you just through engaging in these bodhisattva practices to deal with your current problems better. So that when you do have problems, difficulties, suffering, you are able to work with it and transform it and therefore have more happiness in this life because you're not going to be burdened by those problems. But the second way of approaching these practices is to help you to attain liberation and enlightenment, the more ultimate goals, right? So don't think that these teachings are only about that second part. They're framed in that way. These are the practices to get to enlightenment, but they have value in our everyday life. They have value in helping us to resolve things that we then can, benefit from. And then another thing she wrote in a preface to another book that's on your list, that's Teachings from Geshe Jumpa Tekchok on this text. As in most explanations of the Bodhisattva's practices, the ideal is presented. This is something we really have to keep in mind. Even what we were just talking about in Stella's question, that's the ideal, right? Some sort of amazing, courageous being who can do all of that and put others first all the time, who can wear a coat that's lice ridden and take the lice on their own body, right? Often we in the West feel that we should be able to understand and practice everything immediately. However, learning the Dharma is different from learning secular subjects, and we are not expected to be able to put everything into practice at once. That's an outrageous expectation, that you sit here and you go, oh, these 37 things, well, I got to do them all right now. That's not the case. Rather, she says, we practice according to our present needs and abilities. That enables us to progress gradually, so that later we will have the ability to do practices that initially were too difficult for us. Like I was talking, with this example that I just alluded to again of the lice, that is something that takes an amazing amount of selflessness and compassion for other beings. Most of us, again, would probably take the dirty lice-ridden coat and we throw it to the side and say, well, I hope they figure out what they need to do. Not my problem. Or we might even burn the coat or something, thinking, we're going to get rid of those little guys or something. But so don't think that this means that that's what you have to practice, because this is what Togme Sangpo did, and he's a great bodhisattva. You will eventually get to a place where that will be as natural for you as anything else you do right now. That act of virtue will seem completely normal, but you have to get there. You can't expect to be there right now. So know that this is part of what we're engaging in too here, is we're looking at practices that do go beyond our ability at this time, but we will attain the ability over time. Even though some practices may seem to advance for us now, we can still appreciate and respect those who are able to engage in them, and know that one day we too will find these practices within our ring. And I think it's very true. When we see people who do this in our lives now, we might think, oh my gosh, how can they possibly do that? But, we could be that too. We just have to move in that direction. So have some faith and confidence in the teachings, and recognize that not all of them are, something we're advised to practice immediately right away, or what have you. I want to go very briefly into the contents and outline of this text before we actually start on the verses, or maybe even take our little break before then. I have also put an outline of the text that comes from Dr. Nick Rebush, who did a little mini course he put together on this that I didn't take a course with him, but I got a hold of the outline that he used. So I want to introduce you again to let's start with the outline of the text, because I think that's actually the better place to start. So let's go here. No, here. This is the outline that, again, Dr. Nick put together. The text essentially, and there are different outlines, different ways that you could parse up this text, but this is one we use often in the Geluk tradition, and that book by Geshe Jumpa Tekchok actually uses this outline. The virtue at the beginning, so the virtuous part that is the introduction to the text, which we'll look at this evening. The virtue in the middle, which is the main part of the text, it's where we begin the actual verses of practice, and that's a good chunk of them. And then the virtue at the end, the conclusion, where we finish off those verses. I won't go into all of these. Know that tonight what we're going to cover is the virtue at the beginning, the introduction. I've already stated the name of the text, but we'll see it being stated more formally in the text when we look at it. There's an offering of praise. There's a brief explanation, which is a single line of praise or homage. And then there's a more extensive explanation. That's a single verse. And then there's the promise to compose, which is the second verse that is in this introduction. Then we go into the verses, and there's some preliminary practices involved. We're going to hopefully start with verse 1 tonight. And then we go into 3 levels of practitioner that you all know from your study of the Long Rim: an initial level, a middle level, and a more advanced level. Talk about bodhicitta and how to cultivate it. Go on to talk about this whole section that I just alluded to, that it's a low jhana, transforming unfavorable circumstances into the path. When we're not in meditation, when we're up off our cushion and encountering various things. So that's a very rich section of the text. And then there's a little bit on emptiness and ultimate bodhicitta. And then we have the last several verses, what about 13 verses, the virtue at the end, engaging in the trainings of bodhicitta, which are the 6 perfections, some additional practice advice, and concluding. So over the course of this time together, we'll go into all of these verses. This is the text that we're going to be using, the translation of it. And just know that all these things that I'm showing you on the screen are things that I have put out on the Google Drive. We will have a link to that on Siddhigarbha's website. So just be patient, that'll be out there. But for example, the text and commentary, what I just went through, the outline is there for you. That's the outline that I just showed you. And then the text itself is this. And let me go ahead and make it a little bigger, and I'll just talk about this here. But when we go through the text, you'll see that again, it's composed by Geshe Gyatso. This is my root guru, my teacher in Italy, who I studied with for 7 years over there. He put together this commentary, again, when he was doing his own teachings on this in 2003. So we're going to go into kind of his whole explanation. It's not a very long thing. You'll see the upper left-hand corner there. It's only 14 pages. But, I'm going to hopefully give some explanation of what he had in his text. Oh, I didn't even have this on the thing. Sorry.
Yeah, we don't have.
Sorry, I was meaning to share it. I went there and then I didn't share it. Sorry, this is where you'll have a link to this. And again, you'll have some other things here that I'll point out. But this is where the text and commentary is. The outline that I went through earlier, and then again, when I was just talking about the text.
That'll
Again,
be on our website tonight.
Okay, yeah, John will put it out there so we have that, so you can access the materials. Don't feel bad that you don't have the text in front of you now. I mean, if you need a printed copy, let us know. We'll make sure that we'll print one out for you and so on. But it's not a very long commentary from my teacher. But I feel really honored that I can do this. Venerable Joan was fine with me using that translation and the commentary. She'd really like to get more of Geshe Gyatso's small writings and what have you that he did out in the public. So feel free to use it in your studies. That's maybe enough on that topic. Let's finish off this little introduction. Again, that's the translation and commentary. That's a picture of Geshe Gyatso, my teacher in Italy. He's died in November of 2007, and his reincarnation took a number of years to be identified. It's really quite interesting. His reincarnation looks a lot like him. He's a young boy, 11 years old or something like that. And maybe during the break, I'll find a picture of him on the internet, and you can see what he looks like, his new reincarnation. But he was an amazing teacher. I really feel incredibly grateful that I had the chance to study with him.
Was he born into that?
He was, yes. So, additional resources. You do not have to do anything more than just show up and be a part of this course. Don't feel like any of this is needed. But if you do want to pursue some other commentaries that might give you some more information, I'm essentially, just before I go into this, I'm essentially teaching this. We initially advertised it as 10 sessions. It looks like we're going to do 12 sessions now because I've been given a little more time to teach in Santa Fe. So I thought, well, and you all have me here through September as well. So let's just go ahead and teach a few more sessions on this. I'm teaching 12 sessions, each about 90 minutes long, roughly. Geshe Shara taught this text in 2019 in 19 sessions, each 2 hours long, I believe. So I'm going to be condensing things to some degree, and I won't have time to go into all of what's there. So know that there is, again, a list of these additional resources that you can take a look at if you would like to study it in more detail. The first point there, several commentaries exist in the Geluk tradition, our tradition following Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings. And there are also many commentaries from other traditions. And I've listed those in the file on Google Drive as a suggested reading list. I also want to let you know that there is a one PDF file of a commentary that His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave in 1989. And this is where the reference to Geshe Gyaltsen's center in Southern California comes in. His Holiness came there in 1989 to do the Kala Chakra initiation. And so he gave teachings on the 37 practices as a preliminary to those, which I guess this was a common thing for him to do. to actually teach on the 37 practices before that initiation. So know that when you get this link that John's going to put out there, you have one folder that says additional readings. That's where this commentary from the Dalai Lama is. It's about 48 pages. It's not horribly long, but it's there due to the kindness of Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives, which transcribed it all, I believe. But anyway, they're making it available free of charge, so I'm sharing it with you. The other article on there I'm going to talk about later. The suggested reading list has its own folder, and you'll see that it looks like this. There are even more commentaries than what I have on this list. I've got 10 different things, including, of course, 11, if you include the one by the Dalai Lama. There's also a published version of another commentary that His Holiness gave in Bodh Gaya. Can't remember the year of that, 83 or something like that. There's the one I just mentioned, Geshe Jampa Tekchok, that teacher. That's a bit longer. The 37 Practices, that little book I was holding up earlier that was published in 97. That's also a very short one you could use. Geshe Gyaltsen's teachings on this text, who I've alluded to, great Lama who lived in Southern California quite a while. And then Venerable Thupten Chodron's book, Don't Believe Everything You Think. And I've got a few of those here with me tonight. I didn't bring all of these guys. These are a few that are really quite interesting. Number 6 in particular I like, and I'll try to quote from there. It's what actually Geshe Sharab used as one of his things to cite, because it's a real interesting commentary. It's not really like a written commentary. Instead, it's more like using passages from various sutras and other sources to elucidate what is in the 37 practices. The other one that I might mention, I'm not going to go through all these again, but at the very bottom of the list, I really like this one a lot. Reflections on Silver River. Some of you may have heard of Ken MacLeod. He's this amazing teacher who's no longer teaching. I'm not sure, again, he decided that he was going to step away from teaching. But his book, I've got that with me tonight here, Reflections on Silver River, is kind of a very personal, experiential way of approaching these teachings. And so it's not a traditional commentary. And I may share one little section if we get to it, to verse 1 tonight, that is him talking about verse 1 and his approach to that. But he talks about how he got very, very ill when he first began his practice of Buddhism in India or something. And he was introduced into some of what Togme Sangpo taught, and he found it like totally transformative for him. So he's got a really personal relationship with these teachings, and he's quite an amazing teacher, a little unconventional at times from some things I've read, but nonetheless, I think you might find that one useful if you're curious. But there are, again, many other great masters, Devo Kensei Rinpoche, I can't remember the name of the other one. That's a translation of a earlier text that was a commentary as well. But there are, again, some worthwhile things out there, and even some more contemporary ones like from Garchen Rinpoche that aren't on the list. Again, I just felt like at some point I don't want to throw more stuff at you than you can handle. But most of you might be satisfied just attending, and if you want to read one or two, you might stick in the Gelugpa tradition, but you can certainly dabble with some of the other ones.
Do we have these books here?
I don't know that you do. I'm not sure.
So
yeah.
we have to find some.
May have to find them someplace else. Maybe they might have them in libraries and what have you. But let's see. Yeah, Adrian.
What does Lo Zhang translate to?
Lo Zhang. Sorry, I should have translated that when I talked about it. Yeah, Lo essentially is mind, and Zhang is training or transformation. Everything the Buddha taught is mind training at some level. We're training our minds, working with our minds. But this is a particular genre of teachings about training our minds to work with whatever we need to enhance our bodhicitta, to enhance our understanding of emptiness, whatever, kind of making everything into practice. So those are the ones that become really crucial to help transform our daily lives into blissful practice rather than drudgery and problems and difficulties. So,
And the 8 practices are under these Lojong,
well, the 8 verses of
the 8 verses of
training the mind. Yeah. They are essentially a really condensed version of many of these ideas of how to work with our minds on the Bodhisattva path. The 37 practices is a little bit longer and more extensive. And then, of course, something like Shantideva is huge and is really quite encompassing of all the main practices. So let's take a little break. Let's do about 10 minutes. So let's say at let's call it 7 after the hour. So at 17 after the hour, roughly, I'll ring the bell here.
Yeah.
And we'll reconvene. So let me pause the recording and we'll take. Okay, let's go ahead and start the text. Were there any questions before we start the text?
No.
Anyone? Well, anyway, I hope you fall in love with this text as I have. I don't know. I really have enjoyed always receiving teachings on it, and I hope I can live up to my teachers. Speaking of my teachers, once more, let me review with you the picture of my teacher that was in the slides. This is Geshe Jampa
I'll
Gyatso.
look at him closer.
And also, yeah, I'll make it a little
He
bit
looks like
larger.
a wonderful person.
He had an amazing laugh. Anyway, that's him. Now let's see if I do the other photo, will it change? Are you seeing a different photo now?
No,
No. Okay, so I've got to get out of this and then share the other one. Keep in mind what you just saw. And now
Oh, boy.
this is his reincarnation.
How old is he now?
I think he looks a lot like him. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like the same kind of smile. Anyway, he must be now, that picture is when he was 11 or 12. I think he's a few years older now because he's been, recognized as the reincarnation. He's studying at Sarah Monastery, Sarah J. Anyway, that's,
how long does it take to become a monk?
you can become a monk at almost any age. I mean, as long as you can recite the vows and stuff. So usually around 4 or 5, some of them might enter in the monastery, but some later. Again, Togme Sangpo at the age of 14, probably in the early, between 10 and 15 is common. I don't know, sometimes earlier.
Is he in Italy right now, or is he still
No,
Sarah?
he's studying at Sarah
Was in Sarah?
in India. Okay, so let's go ahead and put the text on the screen. Again, this is one reason why it will be good if you do have printed copies for yourself or on a tablet or something, because it is kind of hard. I can't make it that much bigger without getting it off the screen. So even looking at this, it might be a little challenging. It starts off with a simple verse of homage from my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso. So right under where it says commentary by Geshe Jampa Gyatso, there's the line, homage to the venerable holy gurus. Out of your great mercy, please take care of us at all times and in all ways. So even my teacher, who had great reverence for his teachers, and those teachers had reverence for their teachers, and so on. There's this whole lineage of all these amazing teachers that go all the way back to the Buddha, and the Buddha himself having learned in prior lives from other gurus and teachers. This is obviously what Buddhism is all about, is treating those who teach us the Dharma with great respect and paying homage to them, because as it says here, they're the ones taking care of us. We want them to take care of us at all times, to never be parted from the gurus. So again, I won't say much more about that because we have another reference to guru coming up in the very next part. So let's go back to the text and look at the homage from Togme Sangpo. This is where the text actually starts, and it starts with this expression of worship or homage, which has an abbreviated one first, which is Namo Guru Lokeshvaraya. So Namo means I pay homage, or I venerate that being. Guru inserts the Sanskrit guru for Lama, the Tibetan, which means that again we're trying to see our gurus and these other holy beings as being the same essence. Lokeshvaraya. Well, what did we do last week? Last week we did this wonderful practice involving the Buddha of compassion, which in Sanskrit is Avalokiteshvara. Lokeshvaraya and Avalokiteshvara are the same being, essentially. It's usually translated, as Geshe says in his commentary, as Lord of the world. Kind of the idea that you have somebody who is the protector, the Lord of the world, to kind of pay attention to the suffering of all beings and come to their aid. So in this homage, a homage that is usually done at the beginning of the text is a way of acclimating the reader to what the subject matter is going to be. They would have different ones. They might have Namo Guru Manjushriya if it's going to be a text towards wisdom, because Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom. Here that we have Lokeshvara, who is again this Buddha of compassion, we are saying that essentially the subject matter is going to be around the practices of a bodhisattva and the compassionate practices that being engages in. this being that we come to know as Avalokiteshvara, and again, the form that we tend to use and that we were using in the practice last week, I don't know if there's a tanka that thousand-armed Chenrezig. Yeah, we might need to get a big. The story of this being is that he was a practitioner, a great bodhisattva, and doing everything he could to help sentient beings. He had a guru, of course, because all these beings have gurus, who was known as Amitabha. Amitabha is one of the main sort of Buddhas in these 5 different Buddha lineages. He's one of the sort of heads of that lineage. Anyway, according to legend, this is from John Landau's book on Images of Enlightenment. According to legend, Avalokiteshvara, or as he's called in Tibetan, Chenrezig, made a vow that he would not rest until he had liberated all the beings in the realms of suffering. Similar to what you were bringing up, Stella, right? He makes this vow of like, I'm not gonna stop putting effort into it until all the realms of samsara are completely empty. After working diligently at this task for a very long time, he looked out and realized the immense number of miserable beings yet to be saved. Seeing this, he became despondent and his head split into thousands of pieces. Because in a sense, he'd made that vow and then he could no longer hold it because he came to this conclusion of like, sorry, there's just too many, And he exploded into thousands of pieces. Well, Amitabha, his guru, put the pieces back together as a body with very many arms, 1,000 arms, in fact, and many heads. He has 11 heads that are in this chain of heads that are all up from his neck. But essentially, he would have then, the ability to work with myriad beings at the same time, be able to extend to more beings. And if you see the tanka, the picture of that, you'll see that in the palm of every hand, at the end of all the 1,000 arms, is an eye. He's often called the Buddha who looks upon beings with the eyes of compassion. And so it's like he's got these eyes that are constantly observing the suffering of the world and wanting to protect beings from that suffering. So he has that kind of all of this ability that he was granted once he got to a point where he kind of hit his head against the wall and said, I can't possibly do this. This is too difficult. There's too many beings. And that was like the way to release all of that and transform him into an even more powerful being. It's kind of an interesting thinking about it. What does that mean for our own practice? It means that we do have to be aware of our own limitations, but recognize that sometimes with working with those, it's actually how we grow extra heads and extra arms and extra ways of being a benefit. So he's quite an interesting being. I'm not going to, and again, that's the more historical way of approaching it. But when we talk about it as kind of an archetype,
I'm sorry, Zia's not out there anymore, so I'm gonna
have to go look for her. Oh yeah, please do. Do you need some help, Stella?
She's here.
Oh, okay. But when we talk about this Buddha of Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig, in this context, we're mainly not talking about kind of a historical being. We're talking about that Buddha figure being the embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas. When we work with any of these particular beings, Manjushri for wisdom and Green Tara for that enlightened energy, that sort of get-to-itness and get things done, remove obstacles. When we talk about any of those things, we're talking about them as kind of, again, a symbol of that aspect of a Buddha's experience. A Buddha is a being that has all of those, but Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara represents just the aspect of compassion. So when you work with that Buddha, you're working with enhancing your compassion. That's what we did last week in that practice session. There'll be more of those coming up. But anyway, know that, again, that's what that Buddha represents for us. So I've spent more time on this than perhaps what I should, but in that very brief phrase of Namo Guru Lokeshvaraya, we are invoking that being that represents the compassion that is there to tend to the world through the power of the Buddhas and paying homage to that. Then there is a longer homage that is this, and I'm not going to go into great commentary, but I have to say enough about it so you understand what's being said here. Even seeing that all phenomena lack coming and going, still you strive single-pointedly for the welfare of migrating beings. To the Supreme Guru and the protector of Avalokiteshvara, respectfully, I pay homage always with my 3 doors. So Togme Sangpo in this verse In the first two lines, he's pointing out the accomplishments of a Buddha that make a Buddha a really quite remarkable being. When you look at this first line, and again, I'll read Geshe-la's commentary in just a moment. When you look at that first line, even seeing that all phenomena lack coming and going, this is referring to the fact that when you develop that wisdom that I alluded to earlier, the wisdom of emptiness, very profound moment in the Bodhisattva's life when they develop that direct realization of that, they see that there is no inherent coming and going. Things do not come and go in some sort of concrete, substantial way. Instead, nothing has any existence from its own side. And this is something we're going to explore much later in this text, but it is the ultimate truth that a Buddha realizes, that a Bodhisattva realizes as they're moving towards becoming a Buddha. Even though they have that awareness that there is nothing existing inherently and they can abide in that space of wisdom, they still remain active in the world. That second line that was there, put that back on the screen, that's speaking to kind of the conventional side of things. A Buddha attends to ultimate truth all the time, as is said in the first line. They always have that wisdom, knowing that things don't exist in this fictitious way, but they continue to strive single-pointedly for the welfare of migrating beings because they are imbued with the compassion for beings that sees that they have not realized that ultimate truth, and therefore they're still caught up in samsara. We're going to go into this in more detail as we go through this. But remember, in the Mahayana path, the Bodhisattva's path that we are looking at in more detail in this text, there's these two wings of a bird, as we often use the analogy. A bird needs to have both wings to get to its destination. If you've ever seen a bird with a crippled wing, right, it only has one wing to flap, it can't even get off the ground, right, because it doesn't have the proper aspects to its physiology to be able to do that, right? Well, the Bodhisattva's physiology, if you will, or internal physiology, is to enhance both of these elements. On the one hand, the compassionate method in understanding things in a conventional way, the way sentient beings are suffering, the way to address some of that in terms of the practices that help to move in that direction, and then the wisdom wing, which is the deeper awareness that is going to help advance the whole thing, get to a place where you can remove your own suffering and remove the suffering of others. You need to have both of those. If you don't have both of those, you can't become a Buddha. Well, a Buddha is a being who has both of those to the greatest degree. So even though they abide in this state of mind that knows that wisdom all the time, is never parted from it, that's what we call the Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body, that wisdom mind of a Buddha. Even though they have that, they still are active in the world. Oh, wonderful. If you develop some level of wisdom, you can check out of the world. Those on the individual vehicle do, in a sense, check out of the world. They no longer are involved in samsara and they abide in their own solitary peace. Said that they haven't really finished their work and they'll come back in and become a Buddha eventually. But those who are bodhisattvas aspire to never leave everyone behind, to actually stay engaged in the world with the wisdom that knows how to help them. So that's a way of pointing to Avalokiteshvara in particular as embodying the full qualities of a Buddha, the full wisdom of a Buddha, as well as the full compassion. So let's go through, again, this allusion to phenomena lacking coming and going. This is referring to not just the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that the Buddha taught, but even a wonderful verse from Nagarjuna where he expounds on the meaning of that wisdom teaching. Let me read the commentary. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but it says there, with the exalted wisdom of an exalted knower, you see, just as it is, the mode of abiding, suchness, emptiness, which is that all the phenomena that are conventional objects of knowledge are not at all established as any of these 8 extremes of elaboration. They don't inherently come, they don't inherently go. They're not inherently permanent, and they're not inherently annihilated. They're not inherently existent, they're not inherently non-existent. They're not inherently one, nor are they inherently different. You have to kind of qualify it with those words, because things have a conventional nature of coming and going. Like we come into this life, and then we go from this life in a sense. This life gets left behind. But there is no inherent coming and going. Still, by the power of your great merciful compassion, you strive single-pointedly for the welfare of migrating beings. So in spite of abiding in that state of perfect wisdom, that having that wing fully developed, you stay active in the world, due to your compassion, helping migrating beings, suffering beings like ourselves. So then the third line, he comments on to the Supreme Guru, you who teach me the Mahayana path, and the protector Arya Avalokiteshvara, embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas, who is inseparable from you. Respectfully, I pay homage at all times with my three doors, with my body, speech, and mind. So remember, I alluded to earlier this idea of the Guru and the Buddhas being inseparable. Many of you have encountered these teachings. When you get to a certain level of your practice, particularly when you get to tantric practice, that is what is the whole path is about, is seeing that the gurus are the manifestations of that enlightened energy in our lives. And it makes some sense, right? If we say we're going to become a Buddha for the benefit of other beings, well, then how will we benefit beings? How would you appear to sentient beings like ourselves to help them? Well, I suppose you could appear as just about anybody, but probably the most likely candidates for where the Buddhas are appearing are in the form of teachers, lamas, gurus, these amazing beings who have these incredible qualities, like the Dalai Lama, like Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and so many other beings that some of you have encountered and that we know of in the world. Those beings are dedicated to the welfare of others, and they are appearing like us because that's what we need. We need somebody who can relate to us and talk to us and share Dharma with us and be with us and so on. We tried to relate to this sort of Dharmakaya aspect. Over here on this side, I didn't talk about it as much. This compassionate side of it is what causes the Buddhas to appear in what are called Rupakaya, which are form bodies. Buddhists have to appear in some form to relate to us. If they're just over here hanging out with this wisdom mind, well, how are they helping us? They're just this wisdom mind that is pervading everywhere and knowing everything. They have to take form. And just like Shakyamuni Buddha had a physical form and continued to benefit beings while he was teaching the Dharma and so on. We still need those kinds of physical forms in our lives, people appearing before us that embody all of those qualities that can help inspire us. In fact, I think it's in this Ken MacLeod's book I mentioned earlier, where he uses the opportunity of that verse to talk about what inspires us. What really inspires us? Our gurus, those lamas, are the ones that should inspire us. When we see their faces, or we read what they've written, or we actually attend teachings with them or something, we feel like we're getting what we're searching, what we need, what we're seeking. Right? So this is an important thing, is to recognize that this is a part of our path, to really see that our reliance upon our gurus, and eventually to try to see our gurus in the most beneficial light, which is that they are Buddhas appearing in this world to benefit us, which Alex Sullivan, who used to come here and was the former director of the center, used to say that's a bit woo-woo. Sometimes Buddhism does touch on woo-woo stuff, where we're dealing with things that might not be so easy to accept. But a lot of spiritual traditions have mystical aspects to them, right? Beings that appeared, beings that died and 3 days later resurrected from the grave, came back and taught people, on the basis of a transformed experience and what have you. So there's a lot of woo-woo out there. So don't think that Buddhism, should be discounted because of any woo-woo. But in Buddhism, the woo-woo is, we are dealing with enlightened beings. In fact, John Landau, who I mentioned earlier, one of his teachings that I was reading, he said that he traveled with a friend in India, and this friend told him once, there are enlightened beings in this world, and it is our duty to meet them. It is, our responsibility to meet them. And in a sense, that makes some sense, that there are beings out there who haven't given up on us. They're there to help us. We might have to go climbing some mountaintop. That's the ideal, right? Of this guru sitting there at the top of a mountain, and beings come up and manage to find him. But beings are around us all the time. Gurus are around us all the time. We have to find them and really benefit from them. But the ultimate view is to see them as inseparable from our own, from the Buddhas, to see that the Buddhas and the Gurus are essentially the same thing. Let's go on to the next verse, because I do want to at least get through this and maybe touch on briefly verse 1, which is the first practice. This is the promise to compose. This is also a very frequent thing in almost all texts. It's set up for a couple of reasons. One, especially if you have a longer text, this text isn't so long, but if you're doing like a huge commentary on some other Indian text or something, you want to make a promise to compose so you keep the energy going to fulfill that promise. It's like a pledge you're making. I'm going to do this. And then you will keep the energy and stamina to engage in the full text. But it also kind of follows in the tradition of all the great Indian masters and Tibetan masters and everything who have done this same sort of work. This is what he says in his promise to compose. The complete Buddhas, the sources of benefit and happiness we were just talking about, right? These enlightened beings, they arise from having practiced the holy Dharma, right? You don't get Buddhas. Buddhas don't just come into existence from nowhere. They come from having practiced the holy Dharma. Well, what does practicing the holy Dharma depend upon? That in turn depends on knowing the practices. You have to actually study and know and meditate on the practices to achieve them and become a Buddha. Therefore, I will explain the practices of Conqueror's children. So he's essentially saying, if you want to achieve the result of Buddhahood, well, guess what, folks? You have to create the causes. And if you want to create the causes, you have to know what they are. You can't just hit and miss, I'll do this and I'll do that, and maybe I'll become a Buddha. You want to know what are the practices, I will engage in them, and then I'll achieve the result. So I'll just read this real quickly. Since the complete Buddhas, the sources of temporal and final benefit and happiness, arise from a cause, they arise only from having practiced the holy Mahayana Dharma properly, while on the learner path, while they were bodhisattvas moving in that direction. That, in turn, depends alone on knowing its practices. At the beginning, the first point there, the generation of the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, which we talk about all the time, right? Which has its root in great compassion. Great compassion is compassion that's not just wanting beings to not suffer, but becoming the agent to free beings from suffering and the causes of suffering. And the second point, then, after generating bodhicitta, the way to accumulate these two collections that comprise the six perfections. The method side, the compassion side, which is generosity, morality, patience, and so on. And the wisdom side, the perfection of wisdom, the realization that phenomena lack inherent existence that we were just talking about. So you have to engage in the practices that will help you to accomplish the full culmination of both of those wings of method, compassion, and so on, and wisdom. Therefore, for the welfare of those desiring to train in the Mahayana path, in order to attain Buddhahood, I will explain the practices that are the way to train in the thoughts and conduct of Conqueror's children, as they are set forth in the scriptural baskets of Mahayana Bodhisattvas and the commentaries on their intention. So Geshe Japa Gyatso is simply elaborating on what Togme Sangpo is saying in his verse, saying essentially what Togme Sangpo is going to do, is making a promise to do, is to give us an explanation of all the practices that are essentially the mind training, the thoughts, as well as the conduct, the behavior of bodhisattvas as they're set out in all of the Mahayana scriptures. So essentially, this is kind of setting the direction for everything else that's going to follow. First, paying homage, which again is quite common in all the texts. We make some sort of homage to beings that we are wanting to invoke that power, and then making a pledge, a promise to actually set out what the subject matter of that text is. All right, so I don't need to say much more about that, I don't think. Let me introduce you very briefly before we go, the first verse that is the first practice, right? So this is just the second page of Geshe-la's commentary. This section is called the freedoms and endowments, which are difficult to find. This is actually the first of 7 preliminary practices that are taught here. This one kind of sets the stage for everything else too, because it speaks to the fact that we are right now dealing with the perfect opportunity to engage in the bodhisattva practices. At this time, when the ship or the boat of freedoms and endowments, these are what signify this human rebirth as having incredible value, that are so difficult to find, now that we've attained those freedoms, the ship of freedom endowments has been attained, in order to free themselves and others from the ocean of cyclic existence, samsara, to listen, think, and meditate day and night without indolence, without any kind of distraction, that's a practice of the Conqueror's children. Now that's a pretty tall order. Think Listen, think, and meditate day and night without indolence. So we're not saying that you absolutely have to do that, but we're saying that you have to engage in as much practice as you can. You have to especially engage in those three levels of cultivating wisdom, which is listening to teachings or reading them, doing what you can to bring more information in. Remember, Togme Sangpo is setting this out as telling us what the practices are, helping us to engage in them. So learning about them is a good part of it. That's the first stage. I need to bring that information in through listening to teachings, reading, and so on. Secondly, I need to reflect on them and think about them. Don't just let them sit on the surface. They use this example in Tibet of like barley, ground barley that is on the top of chang, their sort of beer. It just sits there. It doesn't sink into the beer at all. That's, you know what your teachings like that, where they're just sort of on the surface and you haven't brought them into your mind. Well, you bring them into your mind first by really thinking about these teachings, seeing their validity, seeing that it's truth for you. Remember, this is what the Buddha said about his own teachings. Don't take them as gold because the Buddha said them. Find out if they're gold for yourself. So the third step is meditating on them, which is a deeper form of meditation than what we all do, perhaps, but it means to really integrate them into your mind through very deep practice. That's how we change our minds. And of course, the first topic we often begin with, the guru, because the guru is the root of the path, the foundation of all good qualities, as Lama Tsongkhapa says. But the other preliminary topic is the one that's mentioned at the very beginning of this verse, this perfect human rebirth. So I have put together, I put together in the materials folder a couple of things to aid you in this. One is, first of all, a little handout that comes from actually the Wednesday night class that I've been teaching in Santa Fe, the middle length Lam Rim. It's a summary outline of the topics that are involved in this precious human rebirth. I'm not going to have time to go into everything on this list. The term was used in our verse, freedoms and endowments, right? So we go back to that really quickly. Right, it says, when the ship of freedoms and endowments, when we have that, well, what does that mean? That means you have these 8 leisures or freedoms, meaning that you are free from being born in a hell realm. You are free from being a hungry ghost, an animal, a long life God. You're also free from human beings, such as those born at a time when no Buddha has appeared. We're born in the time when a Buddha has appeared. We're also free from being born in a remote country and so on. Anyway, you also have what are called the 10 endowments, which are kind of a more positive way of looking at things. Rather than just being free from what's negative, here is emphasizing the positive things we have. We're born as a human being with a human intellect and an ability to change our minds. We're born with access to the Dharma teachings because we're in a central region, as it's called. We have our complete faculties. We can listen to teachings and think about them. We don't have any mental impairment or, missing our ear sense or eye sense or what have you, and so on. And then we even have the good fortune of being endowed with living at a time when the Buddha's appeared, has taught the Dharma. The teachings are still here. There are practitioners who can help us to follow his teachings. And there are people who support those who are engaged in this type of practice. And we, generally benefit from that kind of loving kindness in our world. That's the first topic in this, is looking at how do we really acknowledge what we currently possess. Then we also look at the value of it in terms of what we can do with it. And again, I'm not going to go through a full explanation of this because we're running out of time, but you can read all of this and go to any long-term text and it'll help you to understand that particular topic. You can even look at the great difficulty in finding it. It's actually said to be quite difficult to get this human existence in the way that we have it now, with all these qualities complete. The second thing that I'm going to encourage you to work with a little bit is this article that comes from the book by Geshe Jampa Tekchok that I mentioned earlier. It's a reprinting of the chapter 3, where he talks about these 3 that I were just alluded to in the verse: listening, thinking, and meditating. Kind of how do we go about engaging in the teachings? Because that's really the basic structure for everything we do in Buddhism. From the very first time you entered into a Buddhist center or read a Buddhist book, you were engaged in developing some wisdom of the Dharma through that first step, at least, of listening, reading, And then as you thought about it and contemplated it, and then eventually we'll get to a point where you integrate it into your mind with a very deep meditative practice. So that's probably good enough for tonight. We'll continue and look back at that verse that I put up there and read Geshe-la's commentary. Let me put that back on the screen. I didn't read Geshe-la's commentary yet, but we'll do that next week. And I also want to share with you what Ken MacLeod says about this idea of a ship or a boat, because it is, worth kind of thinking about that analogy. They often use this idea of like the Dharma and all of this is a way to get us to another destination. It's a boat, it's a vessel that we can use. And this human life is similar. You can use this human life in very productive ways to advance in your spiritual practice. Or you can use this life in many ways that are not so conducive to a spiritual practice, right? We see a lot of people in our world doing that, unfortunately. And no doubt we do that at times as well. But anyway, think about those. If you get a chance to read that article, these are all out on the Google Drive that will be posted on the website later tonight. So any final questions or comments before we conclude?
I want to say something.
Sure, Anne-Marie.
Well, so I was on vacation. I had to come back, and I was on the plane, and with this arm, I couldn't buckle myself in or do a lot of things. But I was lucky. I was blessed. I felt like I was blessed. Kind people sat next to me and understood I couldn't buckle my seatbelt and things like that. And I was helped, and I'm going like, why am I being so blessed? And I felt good about it,
Okay. And that's again the type of karma, if you will, that you're creating through your
I was just wondering
being.
about that.
I think so, yeah. I mean, every experience we have we call it a blessing, but it's not like we're not involved in receiving that blessing. We created that blessing through the good things we've done and how we've been with others and how we've tried to help others and so on. That's how it all works. The more that we do that, the more that our lives become a mirror of what it is that we're doing. We see the reciprocation in terms of other beings coming to our aid, to our benefit. That's beautiful. Wonderful. Okay, let's conclude tonight. If you do have other questions or comments, please hold on to them. And we have the prayer list that has started for our month of July, and Eloise is going to read the names on it. If you have any names you need to add, please let us know. Go ahead, Eloise.
Okay. Under obstacles, we have Chris C. Illness, we have Rolf and Anne Marie. And death, we have Robert Thurman.
Could you please put Clark on there?
Clark
Clark Braswell.
under death.
And do we have Tashi under illness?
No, we don't.
Please put Tashi on.
Yes.
Tashi needs. And then Alyssa, Laura Poligan's daughter Alyssa for obstacles. Alyssa.
Okay.
And anyone else need to be added? Let's put our dear
Yes.
Mary Jo.
Please
I know Mary
add
Jo may want to add others, but and then
for illness.
Actually, the dog for
Sorry, Mary Jo, go ahead. We had some conversation here.
Okay. Ill is Hillary B. And she may be dying, but she's ill right now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mary Jo. Anyone else, any names to add? So again, for all those beings whose names we recited, as well as any others who we've been asked to pray for or who we've offered to pray for, we dedicate for their freedom from suffering and for them to have all the causes that will lead them to true happiness. Let's go to our prayers, and Stella, if you wouldn't mind leading us in the dedication.
Prayers. Due to the merits
of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha, and lead all living beings without exceptions into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen and rise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish,
but
but
increase.
more and more.
And then for
the long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama in English. Once the wish
granting,
granting,
wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tibetan Gyatso beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled.
and the prayer for the swift return of Lama Zopa.
Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Dwakas and Bhakti Buddhas, victorious most Son, Father and Sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer, here and now. Holding and spreading the Buddha's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged, incomparable and venerable Guru, to you I make request, while striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the oceans of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples.
Okay, thank you all for joining. You go ahead and stop the recording, and again, I'll see you all again next Thursday. So,
Thank you,
thanks so much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Don.